at Michigan Radio, and I want to thank you for joining us this evening for our Issues in Ale event. If you've never taken part in an Issues in Ale discussion, this is a discussion series sponsored by Michigan Radio designed to engage people in conversations about different issues that are going on in the state. So we invite you to sit back and enjoy our discussion. Before we get started, I have a couple quick announcements to make. First off, I want to let you know that our next Issues in Ale event is going to be taking place on Wednesday, October 21st. We will be holding a special It's Just Politics discussion hosted by Zoe Clark, a community high school graduate, who will be previewing the November election and analyzing some of the key races across the state. So we hope you'll join us for that. You can find more information about that in the coming weeks at michiganradio.org or via our email newsletter. Our audience tonight will be muted, but we will be taking your questions. If you have a question, we'll ask you to use the Q&A box that you should see down on your screen, and we'll try to answer as many of those as we can. We are also streaming tonight's event live on our Facebook page, and we'll be recording it. We should have that recording available on our website tomorrow, so if you want to review that or share it with others, we encourage you to do so. And events like these and all the programming that you find on Michigan Radio are made possible by our donors. So our fall membership campaign is going on right now through October 7th. We've currently raised about 30% of our goal. So we would encourage you to become a member or renew your membership by visiting michiganradio.org and just clicking on the donate button. Tonight's event is being done in conjunction with our Kids These Days podcast, which provides an unfiltered look into teenage life. Funding for that podcast was provided by the Michigan Health Endowment Fund and the Children's Foundation. And the executive producer for Kids These Days is Jennifer Guerra. She is also the host for tonight's discussion. So Jennifer, take it away.
All right, thanks. So everybody, welcome to our Kids These Days Issues and Ale. The last time I hosted I was just thinking about this. Last time I hosted a Kids Issues and Ale was during a blizzard in Lansing. So blizzard, and now one on Zoom. So here we go. Let's see how it goes. I want to introduce the three folks who are going to be on today's panel. So we've got Rachel Ishikawa. Oh, and I should say everybody has a connection to Kids These Days. So that's how they were also selected. So Rachel Ishikawa is a producer at Michigan Radio, and she was the producer for Kids These Days, which was a youth-led podcast teaming up with community high school. And before she joined Michigan Radio, she was a producer in Philadelphia, and she worked with youth there as well. And then Robbie Stapleton is also connected to community high school. She is newly retired, so congratulations, Robbie. She was a health teacher for 30 years in the Ann Arbor Public Schools, and she directed community high school's depression awareness peer-to-peer program through the University of Michigan for about a decade, and we're very happy to have her on the panel as well. And then we have Kelly Stuppel, who is also connected to community high school. Kelly went to community, right? Did you go to community? She went to community. Her daughter is currently at community. Her daughter worked on the podcast, and Kelly is a child health advocate for Washtenaw County, and she helps families with children and pregnant women access health care, public benefits, and other community resources. And most of her work is with low and moderate income families who have children with acute or chronic health conditions. So we have a really rich panel, and I'm very excited to get started. So I just want to kind of set the table a little bit. We only have an hour, so obviously we can't cover all of teen mental health. So what we thought we would do is use Kids These Days as sort of a jumping off point for what we want to talk about, because the teens in the podcast do talk about mental health a lot, and they come at it through a lot of different lenses. They come at it through technology, through relationships, through vaping, through parenting. I mean, they talk about all kinds of things, and there's this sort of underlying theme throughout almost all of the discussions, and that's mental health. So without further ado, let's get started. So Robbie, can you talk a little bit about the population? I want to talk to Robbie and Kelly about the populations you work with most regularly. So maybe you could describe community first, Robbie.
Oh, community high school is, I like to think of it as a sort of a funky school in Ann Arbor that is housed downtown in an old building. And it draws on kids from their geographic schools throughout the city. So it's a school of choice. Some people call it a magnet school. I've always called it a school of choice. The advantage to that as a teacher is that you get kids who really, 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 really want to be there. And it is, in all honesty, it's not terribly diverse. It is, however, a school of, from my perspective, over the 30 years I've been there, incredibly bright and curious kids, and intent on, most of them are really intent on really sucking the life out of what they can get for their education. So that's community from my perspective.
And Kelly, what population do you work with primarily?
Yeah, so I work with families in Washtenaw County who are seeking ways to access healthcare for their children, or in the case of women, their pregnancy. And most of the families that I work with are facing some type of financial hardship, and many of them have barriers to care, such as immigrants who are unfamiliar with the American health system, or there's language barriers, education and literacy barriers. And then the kids often have disabilities, chronic health conditions, or an acute event in their life that causes them to need healthcare, and they haven't been able to access it for whatever reason. And so I do a lot of navigating for families.
Great. So it sounds like we'll be talking about sort of two different populations, and we'll see where they intersect. And I'm really excited to get the conversation started. So we will start with a piece of tape that Rusty Brock is going to play for us. And we will start with that. So Rusty, can you play the first piece?
Yeah, sure. Hold on one second while I get it to share, get my screen share.
Sounds good.
Maybe not necessarily the root cause of a depression, but anxiety for sure. I feel like we have this expectation that you got to have all your stuff together. You got to have your grades together. You got to know what you're doing after school. You got to be ready for your standardized tests, like all of that. And you have to have extracurriculars, because if you don't, then you're lazy or you don't care.
I mean, it's kind of crazy to think about how high school takes a toll. When you go into high school, teachers always tell you, if you want to get into college, you need to get really, really good grades and really apply yourself. And, you know, I'm here, like, obviously it can be hard. I mean, I'm only in my freshman year, but I'm already starting to see that, you know.
Here's my overall advice. If you fail one test, you are not a failure. That's my biggest takeaway of high school. If you fail a test, if you fail an assignment, if you fail a project, you are not a failure. And I feel like it's so instilled that, oh, you failed that, like, you aren't good enough. No, that's not true. Maybe you didn't understand the material. Maybe you didn't put enough time into it, but like, you as a person are not a failure. Pretty much, I would just say, don't sweat the small stuff.
So thank you for playing that. The start of that clip, she starts by saying, and I think it was just cut off a little bit, but she starts by saying, like, I've dealt with a lot of anxiety and some depression in my life. That's how she starts the clip. And then she talks about the academic pressure. So Robbie, I'd love to start with you. Academic pressure is something that came up over and over with the teens that we worked with as a major source of stress. And I want to hear if that is something you also noticed when you were at the school, and I'd also like you to talk about whether you started noticing it more or less in your 20 to 30 years in the district.
It is a huge stressor for students from my perspective, and it has gotten significantly more acute. I think it starts with, well, from what I've seen over the years that I've been teaching, it really has just ratcheted up, and standardized testing, the competition they feel with themselves, and oddly and sort of sadly with one another, has played a role in that. I think that, when I teach my health classes in my advanced health class, what they say to me is exactly what you heard on the clip. And what they appreciate hearing from me, and I think what they appreciate hearing from their folks and from those who care about them, is it's not you. It's not you. It's not that you're not doing enough meditation or yoga or exercise. It's the world you live in. And that has significantly changed. When you think about it, the competition for being perfect and getting into they know, they're really smart kids, and they have known from the start, from the get-go, that they are an investment. And they know that one little slip up, one little B- or A- can spell a huge difference in their future prospects. That is something that the culture is doing to them. It's not their fault. And I can tell you that when they hear me talk about that, there's like a little sense of relief for them, because they're walking through the world thinking, if I'm resting, I'm feeling guilty. If I am not productive, that's on me. I'm being procrastinating. And I would just call that sort of internalized capitalism, but that's my perspective. And so when I hear them talk about the pressure, I just want to relieve them a little bit of the pressure to be perfect and falling into this notion that you always have to be perfect and productive. You don't. On the other hand, they would say, and I hear them say, but we do. And they're right.
So what do we do with that? How do you live in that middle space there? Kelly, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard to know what reality is, because they do have this feeling that every misstep could impact them negatively in the future. And yet we who have gone through whatever we've gone through to become adults realize that missteps, questions, failure, uncertainty, that makes room for growth, right? So if you're always perfect and you're always trying to make sure that nothing bad happens, that you don't ever make a mistake, how will you grow? However, they haven't yet been through the process of, say, applying to colleges. So they have no way of knowing if that B- will in fact mean that they can't go to the college of their dreams. So it's too many unknowns for them to feel comfortable saying, oh yeah, it's okay, I'm not going to sweat the small stuff, because they don't know what the small stuff is. Is this a small thing, or is it really going to be meaningful? And I field calls literally every week, sometimes day after day, from young people and from their parents who are looking for either group support or individual therapy, because they are not enjoying their lives and they feel like something's wrong here. They're getting messages, you should enjoy your life, you're young, have fun. And then they're also getting these messages, buckle down, this is important, this is not a dress rehearsal. So they feel conflicted, they want to have fun, they want to be able to experiment, enjoy their lives, but they don't really know if ultimately they'll pay the price.
I also, seem to notice that they feel a little bit alone, like maybe they are not, they're unique, like not everybody is feeling the same way. Rachel, I'd love to have you talk about, we had a student who has anxiety, an anxiety disorder, who was in the podcast, and she did an audio diary where she sort of captured what it is like to live with this anxiety. And she got a lot of feedback. Rachel, do you want to kind of talk about a little bit of the feedback that she got?
Yeah, so we had this student carrying around a recorder for about 2 weeks, checking in throughout the day and talking through anxiety attacks, talking through also really mundane moments, just walking around her house, but just really capturing what it was like to live in her body. And the feedback was really exciting because across the board, it was positive. It was both coming from some of her peers. So some people like even texted her and was like, hey, like that meant so much for me that you put that out there. To hearing an experience that I have reflected in somebody else is powerful. But then on social media, we also got responses from parents who are saying, this is really important to hear. I have a child who can relate to this. So it is like a pretty universal feeling, I think, for a lot of young people. And having your experience reflected is important.
Yeah, and Robbie, you mentioned that you've seen it kind of tick up over the years. So you've been in the district for 30 years, I think, yes. So was anxiety and depression as big? I want to just get a little bit more nuance there. Was it this? It wasn't this big, obviously. So tell me when you started noticing a change.
Well, I'd like to, I wish I didn't have to say this, but I do think 2009, 10, with the advent of smartphones in the hands of most kids starting in junior high, I did start seeing more diagnosed cases of anxiety, depression. I am not somebody who blames social media for every ill that young people are suffering. So I want to issue that caveat. But I do think in the last 10 years especially, and maybe it's more diagnoses, maybe it's better diagnoses, but I can tell you that, there's a lot of people who study this, and what we are seeing is hospitalizations because of cutting or self-harm, suicidal attempts, suicidal ideation, anxiety, and depression has in fact what I would call skyrocketed. I've got numbers for you, but just let me assure you that whether they come from Jean Twenge, who's done this work at in her book iGen, or from Social Dilemma, the new documentary that's out, these numbers just started escalating in 2009 and 10, 11, and have gone straight up in the last several years since then.
I want to stick with the phone thing for a minute, and I know it does seem, if you're talking about Gen Z, everybody, of course, we're going to be talking about the phones, and but the students came at it from a slightly different way. They looked at how their phones affect their behavior. So I'd love to play a clip from the podcast. And Rusty, I'm going a little bit out of order, but it's the tracking clip, if you are able to pull it up. Or not.
No, hold on.
Okay.
All right, I'm starting it now. Sorry about that.
Tracking your kids, but I think once you start checking it out of distrust is when it becomes an issue. Sorry, Mom and Dad, if you're listening, but we leave our phones places if we're going somewhere. And if you think about it, that's kind of dangerous, because then what if something happens and you don't have a phone? So I think my message to parents is just be conscious of how often you are checking in on your kids and how you're making them feel by it, and try to avoid the reason for location tracking being mistrust, because trust, if your kids feel trusted, then they will be more honest and in the end, I think, more safe. And I guess my message to kids is I know it sucks, but it won't be forever.
So that particular student said she talked to her parents and said, now that I'm 18, are you going to stop tracking me on the phone? And they said, oh, no, we're going to keep tracking you. And it was just sort of like an understood. And she was like, oh, I guess this is just like the way of life for me now. But she did talk about how it did change her behavior. And it seemed to, in the students that we talked to, lead to a lot of fights between parents and child and stress. And I guess I'm curious, like, what role do parents play in all this? Should they, are they contributing? Does this contribute to stress, or not? What do you think?
If you're asking me, I would say these kids' lives center around being productive, being competitive, being surveilled either by parents or even other authority figures in a way that my life certainly didn't, and I'm really old. And I think it produces a lot of stress and anxiety for them. I wish they had the opportunity, more than they do, to make those youthful, juvenile mistakes that we got to make, I got to make, I should say. And I wish Power School and Gradebook in some ways didn't exist, because how does it feel to someone to be evaluated every minute of every day? And I would sit in class and they would get notifications when a grade dropped by a percentage point. They get notifications on their phones when they didn't turn something in. And then they start getting the texts from their parents. This is real, and this is the world they live in. If I had any advice for parents, I would say use those programs very judiciously. And I agree with Anya that, less is more.
Well, and I'd like to put on my parent hat here for a minute instead of my professional hat. I can say that in terms of surveilling the grades, I'd never been particularly attuned to Power School until COVID. And my daughter did a class online. It was a health class this summer. And I was obsessively checking to see that her assignments were completed. And I'd never done anything like this before. And I was making her crazy and I was making myself crazy. And I was wondering, what was this about? And I realized that it was about my ego. The thought of my daughter, I'm the child health advocate for the county, that of my daughter failing a health class was too much for my ego to withstand. And I felt like I had to be on top of it every minute. And because it was a new thing, this doing class online, I didn't trust the process. I didn't trust her to be able to be mature and measure out her time and her work appropriately. And she has never given me any reason to doubt her ability to manage her time. Yet the combination of my ego and the newness of doing school online, and probably some anxiety thrown in there about COVID and college applications for a rising senior, all of those things made me frankly unbearable to both of us.
I absolutely love your honesty. Thank you, Kelly.
So how did you pull yourself away eventually? I'm assuming you did, sounds like.
I didn't.
You didn't?
I held on with bleeding fingernails to the bitter end.
Oh no.
And even to the point where I was emailing the teacher at the last moment to say, I'm sorry, I'm so crazy.
And did you talk about it with your daughter?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And she tried to help me calm down. She tried to encourage me to trust her, but she also didn't engage with me very much because I think she felt it was a losing battle.
Mm.
Yeah. She just resigned to the fact that I was going to be impossible in this area.
Just leaned into it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting because you actually have in the podcast a conversation with your daughter on tape. And intergenerational conversations is something Rachel was really pushing for in the podcast. And so we did a lot of those. And Rachel, do you want to talk about sort of what you noticed with those intergenerational conversations, or why you pushed for them and what you noticed?
Totally, yeah. I mean, so there's intergenerational conversations across the board, right? I'm a millennial. I saw that there was a question out there about millennials. And then, we were working with the students' parents also. So there's conversations happening at different generation levels. And that's always exciting, right? Because you can find similarities and some key differences also. But I think why we were so excited about these conversations with parents, that they revealed something very intimate. And in some ways, there's this phrase that a microphone is a passport. There's some kind of handout that you get when you put a microphone in between two people that just fosters a really fruitful conversation. It kind of adds almost like a third party or an intermediary and just kind of eases the tension. There's this Snl skit that you all can check out afterwards of a dad and a son who decide to make a podcast together, and they can't have conversations in normal life, but then they sit down for their podcast and they get really deep with each other. And I'm not saying that's the case for the students who were working with us, but I think that the conversations that were recorded between parents and their kids was so powerful, including your conversation, Kelly, that you had with your kid. I mean, that was such a beautiful moment. They were talking about race and how they do talk about race within their family. And yeah, I think I can't stress enough how much a microphone kind of adds an interesting dynamic. And I think there's some power in just having somebody ask you a lot of questions and you being on the other end of that. I'm not a parent, so I can't speak from that perspective, but I definitely heard parents opening up in a way, and the dynamic was very much the kid asking the questions to the parents. And that was exciting for me to hear.
Well, if you're just joining us, we are talking about kids these days and some of the themes of mental health that came up during the podcast. We've got Rachel Ishikawa. She's the Kids These Days producer. Kelly Stuppel is the child health advocate for Washtenaw County. And Robbie Stapleton is a newly retired health teacher in the Ann Arbor Public School District. That's a beautiful segue, Rachel, that you just gave us. We are going to play a clip from the episode where we talk about race, and it is an intergenerational conversation. It's not the one that Kelly has with her daughter. It's a different mother-child set, but we will play that and talk about it right after.
Do you think that we talk about race enough?
I've been thinking a lot about what kind of job have I done for you? It's I always wonder did we equip you well enough, or did we help you, in your own kind of sense of self?
I mean, I feel like I'll always be insecure about my identity, just because no matter how many books I read, no matter how many diverse friends I had, I always felt inherently lesser than, just because I either didn't look like my white friends, I didn't look like my mixed friends, or I didn't look like my black friends. I have had to go out of my way to learn about race, and I don't think that's necessarily your fault. I think that's the school curriculum. And so I think that if I didn't have that initial curiosity or grow up in a space where like we've all been willing to talk about our experiences, that I wouldn't like be able to learn as much as I have. But it just kind of sucks that you have to go out of your way to learn about things.
Yeah.
But I think about race every day, so it's like it's hard not to.
So we've got systemic racism, there's, protests sweeping the country. It's on people's minds. People are talking about it. I'm wondering what role parents can play to help teens deal with the stress of race, of racism specifically. And Kelly, I'd love to talk to you about that. It's something you did talk about with your daughter in the podcast, so I'd love to hear how you address it.
Yeah, so race has always been central to my identity, and looking at questions of race with Leah has been, one of the richer parts of our relationship, I think, because it's an area where we experience the world differently, where I can bring a different kind of experience to her. In many ways, we're very similar. So I think a lot of our experience have been the same, but around race, our experiences have been very different. I was a child in the 70s and the 80s, and race was dealt with differently, even though we were raised, 10 miles away from each other, basically. So I think what Stephanie was saying about, have I done a good job? Like that kind of insecurity runs throughout parenting for a lot of us. And it also gets back to why parents track kids, in the previous clip. We're fearful. And race is something that creates a lot of fear in the lives of kids of color, and very much so in the lives of parents of kids of color.
That clip also, she talks about how she doesn't believe schools do enough. Schools are just sort of abdicating the role of the job of doing any sort of education around these issues. Robbie, I'm curious to know if that's something that has come up at community, or if it's something you've thought about or talked with your students about.
I remember 20 years ago, there being what I would call the community's sort of Black Lives Matter sort of come to Jesus moment. Maybe it's 25 years ago, at least 20 years ago, and being really confused by it. And now I'm not confused by it at all. And I think it is a huge stressor for kids. Generally speaking, it's out there and it's palpable. And I think especially when I teach my advanced health, public health policy class, we are very conscious that, and we include it in the curriculum, that when your zip code is the bigger determinant of your health than any of your behaviors, you have to take a different look at health than we traditionally do in quote unquote, high school health classes. That individual health there is really no such thing. It is public health. It is economics. It is culture. It is zip code. And it's in the ethos. It's like, it's there, you touch it, you feel it. And especially, after we left school in March with the George Floyd murder, I just think that kids are so smart, and they feel it, they know it. And I personally believe that one really good antidote to anxiety and depression is action. And that's not to say it's their responsibility to solve this. I don't believe that either. But we definitely talk about it. Probably need to talk about it a lot more.
That was something that also came up, was what people do and don't talk about when they're talking about racism and race. That came up with the different parent conversations, which was very eye-opening. You mentioned resources or things to do. When it comes to mental health, do you have some go-to strategies, coping mechanisms, resources you recommend that teens check out or teens and their parents check out?
The group that I work with at school, DAG, we call it DAG, but it's the peer-to-peer depression awareness group that's been in the school for the last 10 years. And it's run through the University of Michigan. It's very big on you're not alone, go talk to somebody. And I'm a big advocate of talk to anybody, talk to your friends, talk to me, talk to our counselors, talk to your forum leader, just talk to somebody. It generally makes you feel better. You know, I think that, to be honest, mental health care is lacking. Generally speaking, in the United States, and affordable mental health care is really lacking. And then when you add to that the burden of being a teenager, and I hear this all the time from the teenagers I work with, why would I tell a perfect stranger who's getting paid all of my deepest, darkest secrets? And as an adult, an old person, I think, well, why wouldn't you? But for them, that's a very weird sort of concept. So as I said, I just think just talk in general about it, reduce the stigma, be aware that you're not alone. Everybody feels crappy sometimes. And I really do believe that in the age of COVID, if you don't feel anxious and oddly unbalanced, that's maybe something wrong with you. And I don't want to overstate that, but these are troubling times.
Kelly?
Yeah, I'd like to give a shout out to Corner Health in Ypsilanti. They are a medical provider that works with people ages 12 to 25. And their focus is on Washtenaw County, but they do see kids from other counties. And not only are they interested in kids' physical health, they really have a great emphasis on behavioral health as well. They have 2 clinicians on staff currently and are actually bringing 2 additional clinicians on staff over the next couple of weeks. They have room for kids who need therapy, so definitely call the Corner Health Center. You can reach out to Nikki Griffin and she can get you an appointment. They're doing telehealth right now, so transportation then is not a barrier for our kids to get to therapy. And then they can also get involved in groups. They bill insurance or do sliding fee. So they're very, very accessible, and they have a real commitment to working with kids of color. They have a real commitment to working with LGBTQ kids, and you know, they just do a tremendous job. So I love that. And the other thing that I do in my family is that we see mental health care as just another specialty care, right? So if you have asthma, you're going to go to the pulmonologist. You won't go all the time, but if you're having a crisis, you'll go. And for us, mental health is the same way. You might not see a therapist for years, but you may go through a patch where you're like, hey, I think I need to go. Maybe I need to go with somebody, and we do couples counseling, or we do mother-daughter or father-daughter, or however we want to do it, all family. But to treat it as a normal piece of healthcare and not to stigmatize it as something that's abnormal or negative in some way, but just that mental health is like taking care of the rest of your body.
Kelly, do you know if Roz is up and running? The regional health program at Scarlet, and
so I'm not sure what Roz is doing at this time. I suspect they are doing telehealth like most places are. They also have location, I believe, in Flint and Ypsilanti, as well as Ann Arbor. So the Regional Alliance for Healthy Schools through University of Michigan, if anybody's interested in looking that up. And they have mental health counseling as well as physical health care.
You know, we made Kids These Days before, or I should say the students sort of plotted out what they wanted to do in the podcast before COVID. And then things shut down because of COVID, of course, and we all retreated to our homes and made the podcast from home. And we did address COVID a little bit, but really their stories had already been plotted out. And I'm very curious to know if, because of COVID, are you seeing different types of calls that maybe teens or parents are calling? Kelly, I'm thinking of you here specifically. Is there an uptick in calls? Are there things that people should be looking out for or aware of or thinking about in terms of teen mental health during this time?
There's definitely an uptick in the request for behavioral health services. And I'd like to add that there's mental health, and then we talk about it sort of generally as behavioral health so that we include addiction health as well. And so one of the things we've seen with COVID is an increase in use of substances as a coping mechanism. So that is a real concern, especially in the beginning of the pandemic when people were sitting at home alone a lot. There wasn't a clear answer as to what was happening. People were drinking more. Kids were smoking and eating more cannabis. And so it was getting pretty hairy there. And so we were making a lot of referrals to substance abuse treatment for families. And this is not just the kids having this problem, adults were having this problem as well.
We have some questions, so I do want to pop over to those and throw them out to the group. Okay, let's see. So this question is from Thomas. It says, it seems it's always been the case that better performance opens more doors to more opportunity. It seems the issue is more about why kids today have less, quote, grit and desire to deal with that pressure than they did 10 or 20 years ago. Thoughts? What do you think about that statement? Do you think teens today have less grit?
No. I think they show an amazing amount of grit and resilience just showing up. They are living in a difficult time. And I get that, you know, I tell the students, when my dad was 18, he was shipped off to war. But when you look at the history of mental health and so forth, the Depression, the World War II, even the Korean War, even Vietnam, you didn't see the uptick in anxiety and depression like you see today. And I think that is really a crisis of meaning and a crisis of culture that is really sort of different. I don't believe in the snowflake theory. The kids that I work with are utterly amazing, to use an overused word. They are better educated, more hardworking, more empathetic. They volunteer more. They are busier than certainly my cohort, and I would say more recent cohorts as well. So I'm not buying that.
Well, and maybe one of the things that Thomas's question is getting at is, you know, how do we build resilience in kids, right? So I think that what we've learned from trauma theory is that one of the things that we want our children to be able to do is to withstand the slings and arrows, right? Like whatever is coming at them, we want them to be able to bounce back from that. And so if we as parents, providers, educators can help our kids figure out ways to build resilience, and whether that's learning how to manage stress and anxiety with healthier coping mechanisms, for example. That's the kind of thing that allows kids to flourish and to overcome, because we can't stop the world. You know, they're not, even though we may want to protect our children, we may want to have them have an easier, smoother way, that's just not going to happen. And so whatever we can do to help them, help build up their ability to manage life, I think will serve them well throughout their adolescence and then adulthood.
Another question from Brenton. It says, did the teens that you talked to see in themselves any similarities to millennials? Rachel, as the only millennial on this panel, I'm curious to know, did they talk to you about that? Did they say they sort of saw this delineation between themselves and millennials, or no? I know you as a millennial noticed some differences between you and them.
I did notice some differences. Yeah, I'm about 15 years older than most of the students. But I think that they were attuned to like the stereotypes of my generation versus their generation. And to be quite frank, like the stereotypes of their generation, that they do lack grit, and that they aren't prepared for the world. And for my generation, it's that, you know, we're apathetic and that we don't care about the world. And I think I'm going to kind of go back to that other question, because I am interested in that question of grit. And I think from my perspective, a difference between, you know, a portion of my generation and a portion of their generation is that I just noticed that the students were just so attuned to the world around them in a way that I was not until maybe I was, 20 years old or something. So, you know, they're good like 10 years or like 8 years ahead of me. They're reading the news constantly. They're hyper aware of the fact that climate is changing rapidly and they'll see the effects in their lifetime. They're hyper aware of the racial dynamics in this country. And they're hyper aware also that they're learning the lessons of my generation, which is that you can go to college and do all the things that you're told to do. And then you find yourselves, you know, like $60,000 in debt and without a job. And it's like, well, that didn't work out too well. So I think that they're very aware of the society around them and how there's bits of it that are crumbling. So I think that it's not a question of grit, but they're attuned to the world and they see it for what it is in a way that I think is way earlier than a lot of us do.
I would agree with that. I think that these kids are super sophisticated. They're also very empathetic. And the combination of those two things can probably make you feel a little bit neurotic, right? Because you are noticing everything and you're feeling everything. However, I'm so impressed with this generation and how sort of analytical and logical they approach the problems. And so I have a lot of faith in them.
We have Shelley, who says that maybe being resilient, I think this is playing off something you said, Robbie, maybe being resilient in the midst of war, for example, looks different from being resilient in the midst of hopelessness, which perhaps is that's how Shelley's characterizing it. Are there coping mechanisms? What would the coping mechanisms be? Do they look different in those two different scenarios?
I do think they look different. I want to reiterate, I think these kids are amazingly resilient. If I had to live with the pressures of social media, just that alone, that would have destroyed me as a teenager. And I can say that with some confidence. And yet they come back and they come every day and they're ready to learn. And they are, as Kelly said, empathetic, and they know what's going on. I would say that the coping skill, look, I'm a health teacher. I'm a huge fan of exercise and good nutrition, meditation, yoga, and help when you need it. Absolutely. I'm also, I've also come to espouse action as a way to get outside yourself. And I'm not saying that they are responsible for solving all the problems that we've created. I am saying that when you pick one thing that you care about and you work on it with other people, it creates a sense of community and you feel like you're doing something. And I think there's something to be said for that, honestly. And whether it's acting to vote or elect somebody that you like, or whether it's acting to sort of create a new system that works better than the one we've so far created, or whether it's just serving lunches at St. Andrews or breakfast at St. Andrews. If you choose something that gets you outside yourself, I do think that's a genuine coping skill. But I also think that we get to, as adults, acknowledge what they're going through and be empathetic as well toward them.
And we have one more question and then we'll have to wrap things up for time. But Lenore asks, how much do you think social media contributes? Which we have touched on a little bit, but I would like to dive in a little bit more. How much do you think it contributes to how students, to their self-image, really?
So in listening to the phones episode, I was struck by how people were curating their own identities online through these apps, and how they looked at the other's presentations of self via their social media persona, right? I think that there's some value in that, right? Because you can kind of determine how you want the world to see you. And yet that can also be kind of a trap and doesn't allow for kind of variety, and like there can be kind of a staticness to it. And so luckily these kids describe in their experience being able to, change their minds, change their sexuality, and how they express that. So I feel like, while we talk a lot about the dangers of social media, I think there can be some advantages to it, and that you get to think deeply about your identity and how you're perceived by others.
I agree. And I also think that these kids are busier than I ever was. And certainly I think for a lot of the kids in the high school, they're just busier than they ever will be in the future. And I think that being online is a way they get to interact with their friends, and otherwise they wouldn't be able to. When you think about the hours they spend in school, the hours they spend on sports or after school activities, volunteer work, work, babysitting their younger siblings, the hours in the day don't allow for a lot of socialization. So I think there's something really, really good about it from that perspective. Obviously, there's the negatives about curating toward perfection, the constant branding, the branding that they feel so much, at least from what they tell me, so much pressure for. It's not going away. So we just have to learn to deal with it. I would definitely recommend that everybody watch The Social Dilemma, which just came out. It's a documentary that I think is worth watching. So
I think something that adults can do is help young people recognize when social media is becoming oppressive or depressing for them. And kids can dump the apps that make them feel bad, or take a break, and know that that is allowed.
And they do. I've had students say I'm off Twitter for at least a month, or I'm not doing Instagram anymore. It's been bad for me. They're pretty smart about it.
And probably modeling it yourself too, as a parent, and talking about how you interact with social media too would probably be helpful. Well, it is time. It is time to wrap things up. Any last thoughts, last words, last things you want folks to know before we sign off here?
I would love to tell the kids on the podcast how much I respect them, and I miss them, and I love them.
I think they did a great job. And I also like to say that, no matter how hard it is sometimes to communicate child to parent, parent to child, just keep at it. I just want to encourage everybody to just keep plugging away, because there are times when you want to wash your hands of it, walk away, but don't, just hang in there for yourself and for your kid.
Rachel?
Yeah, it was a pleasure working with these students. And if you haven't listened yet to the podcast, please do.
And to take a tip from Rachel, if you are having some trouble doing that intergenerational conversation, maybe throw a mic up and maybe it'll make it go a little smoother. Thank you, Kelly. Thank you, Robbie. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you so much for joining us on this panel. It's been a pleasure to talk with all three of you. And I want to let everybody know that, of course, you can hear Kids These Days wherever you get your podcasts. The whole series is out now. And Kids These Days was made possible by very generous grants from the Michigan Health Endowment Fund and the Children's Foundation. So we want to say thank you very much to them as well. And I think Steve Propinski is going to wave us all off here shortly.
I just want to thank everyone for joining us, and great discussion tonight. And everyone have a great evening. Good night.
Good night.